Hi, today I'm going to show you how to remove the fuel tank on your Janus 250. Before we start removing any hardware, you need to remove the fuel from your tank. To do that, you want to turn your fuel to the off position. You want to remove the fuel line from the carburetor end of the fuel line, and you'll take the fuel line and put it over to a fuel safety reservoir, a fuel can. And once it's securely in place and the fuel line is going into the can, you can turn your fuel valve all the way to the R position, which is all the way over here to the reserve, and keep it there until all the fuel is drained from your tank. First, we're going to start over on this side with your fuel on-off valve. We're going to make sure our fuel lever is turned to the off position. Next, we'll remove the fuel line and bleed it. I use a pair of needle nose pliers and a rag. Put your choke in the up position. Slide your fuel line clamp up, gently lifting up on your fuel line, and then use the rag to catch your fuel. Anything that's left in the line will fall out. Then I usually like to leave a little rag underneath here just to catch anything if it drips. Now we're going to loosen up the hose clamp on the airbox side of the intake boot. You don't need to remove it all the way, just get it so it slides down the boot a little bit. Now we're going to loosen up the lower intake bolt using a 10mm open end wrench. This bolt you do not need to remove. You just need to loosen it a few revolutions. Using the same wrench, we're going to remove the upper intake bolt. This one we will remove all the way. At this point, we're ready to remove the carburetor. To do that, grab the carburetor intake firmly, and you'll slide up just over that bolt that we loosened up on the other side. Turn the carburetor to you, slide it off the airbox inlet. For the next step, we're going to remove the airbox, but we'll start by removing the airbox cover using a 4mm Allen wrench. As I'm removing the bolt, I am holding the airbox cover in place, making sure it doesn't fall. And then you can take that and you can set that down on a towel or something soft. Now we're going to remove the air filter element by taking a Phillips or a flathead and just loosening this hose clamp here. And just wiggle that off the mount and set that aside. Using a 10mm socket or an open end wrench, you will remove the two bolts that go to the top of the airbox. Now we'll remove the two lower airbox bolts, one on the left and one on the right. We'll be using a 10mm socket and an open end or a box end wrench. Now your airbox is loose. Simply pull it forward and remove it from the frame. Now we're ready to remove the clamp for your fuel tank ventilation tube. Slide that clamp down using a pair of needle nose pliers. remove the hose. This holds no liquids or anything, so nothing's going to drain out of it. Now we're at the point where we can remove the 4 bolts to remove your fuel tank. Up front, on each side, you have a 13mm socket, and then you have a 5mm Allen in the rear, 1 on each side, for a total of 4 bolts. That should be loose there. Now we'll move to the rear using a 5mm Allen. Now we're on the left side of the fuel tank, removing the 13mm bolt at the front of the tank. There we go. And now we're at the point where we can remove your fuel tank. It's important to know that the fuel valve here will be a tight fit coming out, so make sure you're paying attention to that as it comes through your frame. There we go. Now we're ready to reinstall your fuel tank. I'm going to take the button head Allen bolts from the rear of your tank and put them through here, the rear mounting hole, and then slide the rubber pad down on there. It will hold that in place. Do the same to the opposite side. And then you'll want to do the same to your front, left and right. Front bolts. Push it through the rubber pad. Now we're ready to install the tank again. Make sure your fuel line finds its way through the frame. Get the back of your tank past your seat. And you'll want to line up the mounting holes here with the bolts that come through the rubber pads until you feel everything kind of click into place. There we go. Now we're going to tighten up the front right side. And what we'll do is we'll get all the bolts slightly started, and we'll start tightening the 2 fronts and then the 2 rears, and we'll go around and do the final tighten of all the bolts. That one's started. Now I'll do the left side. And now I'm just starting the rear bolts. Now we're ready to do the final tightening of all 4 bolts. It is important to pay attention to how tight you put them. These tanks are rubber dampened, so you don't want to over tighten them and squeeze the rubber out. You want to leave on the front and back bolts, you want to leave about 5mm of space from the top of your bolt to the bottom of the tank. At this point, we're going to reinstall the airbox. We're going to start with the 6mm bolt that's 20mm long. All 4 of the bolts that hold the airbox on are 20mm by M6, but these have a split washer on them, and those go on the top 2. So we slide this in. Once those are loosely in place, we'll reinstall the rear hardware, and that one has a flat washer on the top, a flat washer, and a nylock nut on the bottom. You want to install the other side. Just finger tight. Now we will do a final tightening of the upper bolts. Make sure you're not over torquing any of your hardware. And now we'll tighten up the lower one. At this point, we're ready to reinstall the air filter. You want to make sure that it's all the way on. Usually I will hold it in place with my left hand as I secure the hose clamp with my right hand. Now we're installing the airbox door. You'll have 2 button head Allens with split washers on them. Line up the top one, get it started, and line up the bottom one and get that started. At this point, you can go ahead and tighten everything up. While your intake is off, you want to make sure that your gaskets are in good condition. You have one attached to the intake. You have a spacer here. Your second gasket is behind the spacer. You can install a little bit of grease. Make sure you don't add too much. This can act as a glue to hold your spacer in place to your cylinder, like so. Also, a little trick is to use some of that same grease on your split washer down here, just a little dab, and that will act as a glue as well to hold that washer from slipping down and getting in your way when reinstalling the intake. One final place that you need a little bit of grease, very small amount of grease, is on the inside of your intake boot. This will allow it to slide onto your airbox easily. Now we'll reinstall the carburetor, making sure that your intake boot slides onto your airbox easily. And then you want to make sure that your intake slides onto that bolt all the way down. Now we're ready to install your upper intake bolt. You want to make sure that your gasket, your 2 gaskets, your spacer, and your intake are all lined up. Feel free to push them around, wiggle them a little bit gently. You might have to move your intake and your carb around just a little bit to find the place where the bolt starts to seat and thread in. Now we're going to tighten the upper and the lower intake bolts using a 10mm wrench. When tightening up your intake bolts, you want to take extra care because you are screwing them into aluminum. So take care not to put extra force on them while torquing them down. Just get them snug. Once those are installed, you can take a rag and wipe off any grease, if you used it, that may have squished out during the process. Now we're going to tighten down the rear hose clamp that secures your boot to your airbox. While you're on the left side of the bike, we can reinstall the fuel line. One important thing that you must do to the clamp is push that forward. That way it stays out of the way of the choke mechanism. Now we're ready to reinstall your fuel tank ventilation line. Put your clamp back in place. Now at this point, you want to take some time to go over, making sure that you followed all the steps, all the hardware is in place, nothing is obstructed from the function of your slide or any other parts of the carburetor. And when your fuel line is hooked up, you can turn your fuel back on.